You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and as the title of today's video implies, today I'll be talking about how I got into anime as a whole. I'm going to be going into detail about the series that helped me jumpstart my interest into the genre, or medium, however you want to look at it. If you've read the full title of this video, then it's pretty obvious what series actually got me into anime, but let's pretend for sake of argument that you haven't read that yet, and let's go back a little bit further. So when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of Pokemon, and a lot of Dragon Ball Z, and Dragon Ball GT. Mostly the original Dragon Ball when it came to those, but just mainly whatever was on Toonami. I didn't watch the episodes in any specific order. I did see the entire King Piccolo arc, which I loved as a kid, and still do to this day. It's one of my all-time favorite arcs of Dragon Ball, but that's neither here nor there. And with Pokemon, I also just kind of watched whatever was on TV, plus I had quite a few VHSs of Pokemon back in the day. But at the time, I didn't know that they were anime. In fact, I had no idea what the hell an anime was. I just thought they were cartoons. Well, as I was getting older, my brother was getting really into anime, and I found out what it was. But anyway, he was really into anime, and he was watching Death Note a lot, and I made fun of him a lot for it, because I'm like, oh, you want to be Asian. Basically, I was calling him a weeaboo before I even knew what weeaboo was, and before the term was even caught on. It's ironic looking back at it now. If you look at my channel, there's a lot of anime stuff, so it's a bit hypocritical and ironic looking back, but, you know, I was a kid. Kids are assholes. Well, there will be spoilers ahead for Death Note, so you have been warned. I'll probably put a disclaimer at the very beginning of the video, but I'm letting you know in advance now. So my brother would often talk about Death Note, and it kind of annoyed me because he wouldn't shut up about it. That will be incredibly ironic when we get into some stuff later on, but yeah. So I constantly made fun of him for it and had no interest in watching it. He would tell me things like, L died, and I'd be like, what, the letter L from the alphabet died? And then he would tell me that Light dies at the end, and I'd be like, oh, well that's kind of dumb that the main character dies. Again, we'll get into it later, I don't care about that sort of thing now. Many of my favorite series have the main characters die. But nevertheless, I had no intention of watching it back then. But then one day, he brought home the live-action Death Note movie, the first one. And to be clear, we're obviously talking about the Japanese Death Note movie, the one that's actually good, not the shitty Netflix one. Well, he popped it in our DVD player and we watched it. We originally watched it dubbed. I have since watched it multiple times, both dubbed and subbed, so I have a feel for how the movie goes either way. After I saw the movie, I was hooked on it. I'll get into why a little bit more later, but suffice to say, after the movie, I went on to watch the anime. So, after I watched the anime, I read the manga. It was actually the first manga I ever read. And then from there, my interest just evolved more and more. Now I'm going to go a little bit more into how I actually got hooked on Death Note. So we watched the movie, and although my brother had told me about it multiple times, he didn't actually go into that much detail about the actual plot itself, just about characters dying and the basic premise of it. But for context, I was a teenager when I first saw the movie. And being a teenager, I had a very strong sense of justice and right and wrong that I felt was very important. Something that I feel like is really more of a teenager thing than anything else. I do think it doesn't go away completely. I do think people do definitely have their moral codes, but I think you feel it the most strongly when you're a teenager. At least I did. So because of that, due to Death Note's focus on justice, I really got into it back then. Not to say that I wouldn't get into it now, because I still fucking love the series, but I'm just saying that was the perfect time for me to see it. For those of you unfamiliar with Death Note, I'll give a brief summary. Death Note begins with a Shinigami by the name of Ryuk. For those of you who don't know, a Shinigami is a god of death, or Grim Reaper, essentially. Well, Ryuk is bored, and what Shinigami have in this universe is they have something called the Death Note, where they write in humans' names to kill them. This is basically their surrogate for a death scythe. The way the Death Note works is once a person's name is written, they will die. No matter what, once their name is written, they die. To an extent, the Death Note can control people's actions before their death, and it can also control the time and circumstances of their death. The only thing is it has to be something that could reasonably happen within the world of the laws of physics and the realm of reasonability. Ryuk is bored with his life in the Shinigami realm and decides to drop his Death Note in the human world. I will also mention that he has 2 Death Notes. That is important because a Shinigami must have at least one in order to continue going on. He had to kind of be sneaky to get a second one because you're not supposed to have 2, but that's something that's another story for another day. So Ryuk drops his second Death Note in the human world, wanting to see what a human would do if they got their hands on it. And so enters our protagonist, Light Yagami. And I say he's our protagonist, but some people might argue it with me. I definitely think he is, but you know, some people could argue it, because L also could be considered kind of the protagonist. And I don't want to hear people saying, oh, he's an anti-hero, not a protagonist, because that's not an argument I'm going to get into here. Anti-heroes are protagonists. That's just how it is. They are. all a protagonist is the person whose point of view that we see, and we see them move the plot along. That's what a protagonist is. Light Yagami himself is a student, and he has a very strong sense of justice and right or wrong. He thinks in moral black and white. He doesn't really think of any gray areas. It's either good or evil. And with that being said, once he gets his hands on the Death Note, initially he's reluctant to use it, but the Death Note itself has a power to draw you in to make you want to test it at least once. So he tries it out on a criminal, and the criminal dies. So he decides to start killing criminals in order to rid the world of injustice. His thought process behind this is justice system is corrupt and that criminals often go free. On top of that, I also should mention that Light himself has been training to be a cop for many years prior to the events of the series, and has even helped the police with previous cases. To make a long story short, Light goes on a killing spree of criminals and draws the attention of the world's greatest detective, L. With this, the series becomes a battle of wits between the two of them, constantly trying to one-up each other. And the part that makes it really interesting is that there are these two brilliant minds. These guys are both super geniuses that are each constantly trying to be one step ahead of the next, and both of them succeed very well in it. For instance, Light goes to extreme lengths to hide what he's doing. He creates this thing that will set the house basically on fire if anyone tries to grab his Death Note. He creates a trap so he would know if someone had entered his room. And he plots all sorts of crazy schemes that keep him one step ahead of L. However, L's sense of deduction is fantastic. He immediately finds out that the killer is in Japan, he immediately finds out that the killer is in the Kanto region, and he immediately finds out that the killer is Light Yagami. Basically, he deducts everything within a matter of, like, 2 or 3 episodes. And at that point, it just becomes a matter of proving it. To make a long story short, things go pretty well for both of them, constantly one-upping each other back and forth, and driving them both kind of nuts to try and defeat the other. Eventually, Light does defeat L, but then later gets defeated by L's successors, at least in the original source material and the anime. However, in the movies, L actually does some trickery of his own and defeats Light, which is also true in the novel, because the novel is based on the 3rd movie as well. Well, one of the 2 novels, anyway. The other one is a prequel, but that's beside the point. Anyway, back to my growing obsession with Death Note. After I watched the live-action movie, I got into the anime, as I said before. When I watched through the anime, it took me only 1 day, really, to complete it. I started watching it in, like, the mid-afternoon, and I continued until, like, 3 a.m. one day. I went to sleep, got up, and finished it the next day. I think I probably took a few breaks in between episodes, but overall I watched through it fairly quickly. I got so into it that I had to see all the movies. I had to see both relights, which if you don't know are animated movies that recap the entire anime series. I got the soundtrack, and Death Note is the first anime soundtrack that I ever owned. I read the manga, and as I said, the manga was the first manga I've ever read. And I got obsessed to the point that I just kept looking things up for it, kept talking about it, and kept going on, and not shutting the hell up about it. Which, as I mentioned, is kind of ironic, because I got mad at my brother for doing the same thing. Because of me not shutting the fuck up about it, a good friend of mine actually still refuses to watch the series to this day, and insists that it is shit. I think he's definitely missing out, and I think he's falling into the same trap I did initially, but hey, I don't have a lot of room to talk because I did the same thing many years ago. Now, as for my thoughts on Death Note, it should be pretty obvious by the fact that I got completely obsessed with it that I absolutely loved it. I've seen through the actual anime series probably 5 or 6 times all the way through, and several other times not all the way through. I've seen all of the live-action movies except for the Netflix one, we don't talk about that one. I've seen the live-action TV drama from Japan. I own an actual Death Note that I got for Christmas one year when I was really obsessed with it. The thing that made me like Death Note so much was just the intelligence behind it. Both characters had their strong convictions, and both of them wanted to be right and win in the end. And the thing I like is it never straight up tells you who's right or wrong. You just see things as they are and make your own conclusions. Ironically, I used to identify with Light's point of view quite a lot, but as I got older, I learned to actually more identify with L's point of view. However, neither character is perfect, and both are flawed, and both essentially just want to win for their own self-worth. As for L's successors, I don't particularly like Nier. I don't hate him per se, I just don't particularly like him. And as for Mello, I think he's actually a very underrated character, but overall he's still not that great of a character, but I still like him to an extent. The quality of the show does take kind of a nosedive after L dies. For a couple episodes, it's mostly just exposition and isn't very interesting. But as soon as they introduce the character of Mikami, it gets really interesting, and it gets just as good as it was before, in my opinion. I've met some people who don't like the Yotsuba arc from Death Note, but I actually really like that arc because it just shows how great Light's plans are and how far he planned ahead to actually get the Death Note back. I also think that there is kind of a distinction between the characters of Light Yagami and Kira. I do think that they are both kind of different characters in a way. For instance, when Light loses his memory of the Death Note, he's a very different person, and I actually like him a lot. He's a very human person, but when he has the Death Note, he's Kira, and he's ruthless. So I do feel although they are the same person, in a way they are kind of different characters. Anyway, as I said, Death Note is by far one of my favorite animes. It was actually my favorite for a good while. It was later overtaken by Elfen Lied and Devilman, but it's still in my top 3. Also, although I've grown more to identify with L over the years, I still root for Light in the end, even though I know he's not going to win. And Light is still overall my favorite character. L is by far my second favorite character, followed by Ryuk, Matsuda, and then the others. As for my taste in anime, it definitely evolved over time, because Death Note was kind of my gateway into the world of anime. But over the years, my tastes have evolved drastically. I've always favored the darker, more interesting, kind of fucked up anime. However, I stayed away from the incredibly graphic and over-the-top ones for the longest time. As I mentioned in my Elfen Lied review, Elfen Lied was actually the thing that changed that and got me into the more fucked up side of anime. And then from there, I would later see Yorotsuki Doji, which got me into the fucked up side of hentai. And as far as my other tastes in anime, I used to actually not like comedy anime at all, but then I saw Steins Gate and that kind of opened my eyes on that. I still don't particularly like sports anime unless you count Initial D. I do actually quite like Initial D. And I'm not the biggest fan of romance anime, however, I do like romance with sort of a tragic element to it, like Clanad, or I also like things that maybe have romance in it that aren't traditional romances, like Elfen Lied has elements of romance in it. Future Diary has a very unconventional romance. But overall, I've definitely evolved into being a lot more into anime than I used to be. In fact, ironically, that brother I used to make fun of, I actually am a much bigger Death Note fan than he is, and I've actually seen quite a lot more anime than he has, so it's kind of ironic looking back. But yeah, Death Note was my entry point into anime. It still holds a special place in my heart. It's definitely one of my all-time favorites, and if for whatever reason you haven't seen it, I'd recommend watching it, because even though I've spoiled it, you can still enjoy it. Because, as I said, I actually had the ending spoiled for me long before I saw it, so I enjoyed it despite that, and it's by far one of the best animes I've ever seen. It's also by far one of the best mangas I've ever read. And as for the live-action movies, they are fantastic as well, at least the 4 Japanese ones. I personally feel the 4th is the best of the bunch, just because it's its own original story. Granted, so is the 3rd, but honestly, if you want to see the 3rd, I honestly just recommend reading the novelization, L Change the World, the novel. There is actually a 3rd novel that's a novelization of the 4th movie itself, but I have not read that yet, as it has not been released in English. Anyway, I know I kind of rambled on a bit here, but I hope I got the point across, and I hope you enjoyed the video. This has been Fugitive Red Eye. Have a great day.
Subscribe to Fugitive Red Eye.